In the late 1970s, a chain of events unfolded that would permanently scar American political history and redefine how the world understood the dangers of unchecked power. What began as a congressional fact-finding mission ended in assassination, and what followed became the largest mass death of American civilians in a single incident outside of war. The remote jungle settlement known as Jonestown was meant to represent equality, safety, and spiritual renewal. Instead, it became the final stage for fear, control, and irreversible tragedy. This story is not simply about death. It is about belief weaponized, trust exploited, and a system that failed to intervene before it was too late. The man who created this system was Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher who rose to prominence during a period of social upheaval in America. Jones preached racial equality, social justice, and communal responsibility, messages that resonated deeply with people seeking meaning and protection during uncertain times. His organization, the People's Temple, offered food programs, housing assistance, and a sense of belonging that many followers lacked elsewhere. Over time, Jones cultivated an image not just as a religious leader, but as a moral authority whose judgment could not be questioned. Loyalty was praised as virtue, while doubt was framed as betrayal. Gradually, Jones positioned himself at the center of every decision, every relationship, and every belief within the temple. What began as admiration slowly evolved into dependency, and eventually, into fear. Followers learned that survival, spiritual and physical, depended entirely on obedience. As the People's Temple grew, so did concerns from former members and relatives. Allegations of abuse, forced labor, financial exploitation, and psychological manipulation began to surface. Some defectors claimed they were threatened for attempting to leave. Others described public humiliations and punishments used to reinforce control. Families wrote desperate letters to government officials, pleading for help in retrieving loved ones they believed were being held against their will. Journalists attempted to investigate but were met with aggressive denials and intimidation. To Jim Jones, criticism confirmed his narrative that the outside world was hostile and dangerous. He told his followers that government agencies, the media, and political forces were conspiring to destroy them. This sense of persecution became a powerful tool. By framing himself as their only protector, Jones tightened his grip, convincing his followers that isolation was not only necessary, but life-saving. In response to mounting scrutiny, Jim Jones proposed a solution that would remove his followers entirely from American oversight. That solution was relocation to Guyana, a small nation with a socialist-leaning government and vast stretches of uninhabited jungle. There, Jones promised, the temple could build a true utopia free from interference. Jonestown was established in an isolated region, accessible only by air or long river routes. Officially described as an agricultural commune, it was promoted as self-sufficient and egalitarian. In reality, its isolation served a different purpose. Communication with the outside world was tightly controlled. Mail was monitored. Radio broadcasts were filtered. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. The jungle itself became a natural barrier, making escape both physically and psychologically daunting. Distance from America allowed Jones to operate with near-total authority. Life inside Jonestown followed strict routines designed to exhaust resistance and reinforce dependence. Days were long, filled with manual labor under harsh conditions. Food was rationed, and medical care was limited despite promises of advanced facilities. Loudspeakers broadcast Jim Jones's sermons at all hours, repeating warnings of impending attacks from enemies abroad. Children were often separated from their parents, weakening family bonds and transferring loyalty directly to the community and its leader. Public confessions and punishments were staged to discourage dissent. Those who questioned authority were shamed or isolated. Jones framed every hardship as evidence of commitment, insisting suffering was proof of righteousness. Over time, constant fear and exhaustion eroded independent thought. Many followers came to believe that survival outside Jonestown was impossible, and that Jones alone stood between them and destruction. Back in the United States, the growing volume of complaints could no longer be ignored. Congressional offices received letters describing abuse, imprisonment, and threats against temple members. These concerns eventually reached California Congressman Leo Ryan, a known advocate for government transparency and human rights. Ryan believed that first-hand investigation was the best way to determine the truth. In November 1978, he organized a delegation to travel to Guyana. The group included journalists, legal observers, and concerned family members hoping to reunite with relatives. Ryan's mission was rooted in democratic principles, accountability, oversight, and open inquiry. He believed that if abuses were occurring, exposure would resolve them peacefully. What he could not fully anticipate was how deeply threatened Jim Jones felt by the presence of outside authority. When the delegation arrived in Guyana, they were greeted with staged hospitality. Jonestown residents performed songs, shared meals, and spoke positively about life in the settlement. Smiles appeared rehearsed, words carefully chosen. Yet journalists noticed inconsistencies. Armed guards lingered nearby. Residents avoided spontaneous conversation. Some appeared nervous, glancing toward Jones before speaking. During a communal gathering, a temple member discreetly slipped a note to a reporter, pleading for help escaping. Others followed, quietly expressing fear and asking for protection. Congressman Ryan began to understand that the reality of Jonestown differed sharply from its presentation. He announced that anyone wishing to leave could do so with his delegation. That moment marked a turning point, exposing the fragility of Jim Jones's control. When the delegation arrived in Guyana, they were greeted with staged hospitality. Jonestown residents performed songs, shared meals, and spoke positively about life in the settlement. Smiles appeared rehearsed, words carefully chosen. Yet journalists noticed inconsistencies. Armed guards lingered nearby. Residents avoided spontaneous conversation. Some appeared nervous, glancing toward Jones before speaking. During a communal gathering, a temple member discreetly slipped a note to a reporter, pleading for help escaping. Others followed, quietly expressing fear and asking for protection. Congressman Ryan began to understand that the reality of Jonestown differed sharply from its presentation. He announced that anyone wishing to leave could do so with his delegation. That moment marked a turning point, exposing the fragility of Jim Jones's control. On November 18, 1978, Congressman Ryan, the journalists, and defectors traveled to Port Kaituma airstrip to board small aircraft. As preparations were underway, a group of armed temple members arrived in a tractor and trailer. Without warning, gunfire erupted. Chaos followed as people ran for cover. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot multiple times and killed. Journalists and defectors were also murdered, while others were critically wounded. The attack was swift and deliberate, leaving no doubt that it was planned. It marked the first time a sitting U.S. congressman had been assassinated in the line of duty. News of the killings would soon reach Jonestown, setting the stage for the final and most devastating act of the tragedy. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones received confirmation that the airstrip attack had occurred. He knew that American authorities would respond swiftly and forcefully. There would be no negotiation, no retreat, and no escape. Jones gathered the community for what he framed as an emergency meeting. He spoke calmly but urgently, telling followers that hostile forces were already on their way. He insisted capture would mean torture, imprisonment, and the destruction of their children. Jones presented only one option, what he called revolutionary suicide. He framed death as an act of resistance, a final statement against oppression. Years of conditioning made this message tragically effective. Many followers, emotionally exhausted and terrified, accepted his narrative without question. What followed was methodical, controlled, and devastating. Large containers of flavored drink were prepared and mixed with cyanide and sedatives. Children were brought forward first. Some were injected, others forced to drink. Parents were told this was mercy, that death would spare their children from suffering. Armed guards ensured compliance. Loudspeakers broadcast Jim Jones's voice, urging calm and obedience, discouraging panic or resistance. Some adults drank willingly, convinced there was no alternative. Others resisted and were restrained. The process unfolded with chilling order. There were no mass screams, no chaos, only quiet compliance shaped by fear and indoctrination. In a matter of hours, Jonestown transformed from a living community into a field of bodies. The scale of death would shock the world. By the end of that day, more than 900 people were dead, including over 300 children. It was the largest mass death of American civilians in a single incident outside of wartime. When investigators eventually reached the site, they found bodies lying face down, arm in arm, scattered across the compound. Photographs taken at Jonestown would circulate globally, becoming symbols of the dangers of unchecked authority. The world struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur. How could so many people comply? How could warnings have gone unheeded? Jonestown was no longer simply a location. It became a reference point, a warning about the power of manipulation and the fragility of human trust. In the aftermath, investigators and psychologists sought to understand how Jim Jones achieved such control. Survivors described a gradual process rather than a sudden transformation. Indoctrination occurred slowly, normalized through routine and repetition. Fear was reinforced daily. Isolation removed alternative perspectives. Obedience was rewarded, dissent punished. Each compromise made the next easier. By the time the final order was given, many followers felt they had no identity outside the group. The tragedy was not spontaneous. It was engineered over years, built through deliberate psychological manipulation. Understanding this process became essential to preventing similar events in the future. The murder of Congressman Leo Ryan intensified national scrutiny of cult dynamics and government responsibility. Congressional hearings examined how warning signs had been missed and why intervention came so late. Journalistic practices were reassessed. Law enforcement agencies reviewed protocols for overseas investigations involving American citizens. Yet accountability remained limited. Jim Jones was dead. Most perpetrators were victims themselves. Legal justice offered little closure. The focus shifted instead toward education, prevention, and awareness. Jonestown forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about oversight failures and the limits of authority. Families of the victims were left to grieve amid public misunderstanding. Many faced stigma, as society often portrayed Jonestown members as foolish or weak. This narrative ignored the reality of psychological coercion. Victims were not irrational, they were systematically manipulated. Survivors and relatives struggled to reclaim their loved one's dignity, emphasizing that belief, when exploited, can overpower logic and self-preservation. Healing was slow, complicated by the scale of loss and the public nature of the tragedy. In the years that followed the tragedy, Jonestown forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about how power operates when it is insulated from oversight. Analysts began to recognize that the events were not the result of sudden madness, but of a carefully maintained system of control. Jim Jones did not seize authority overnight. He accumulated it gradually by presenting himself as indispensable. By meeting emotional and material needs, he positioned himself as both protector and judge. Over time, dependence replaced autonomy. Fear replaced trust. What made Jonestown especially dangerous was not ideology alone, but isolation. Physical distance from scrutiny allowed manipulation to intensify without interruption. Once removed from alternative viewpoints, followers lost the ability to test reality against truth. Jonestown demonstrated how authoritarian systems thrive not through violence at first, but through reassurance, repetition, and the erosion of boundaries. It revealed that the most destructive power structures are often built slowly, disguised as safety, community, and moral purpose. Psychologists studying the aftermath emphasized that intelligence, education, or good intentions do not guarantee protection from coercion. Jonestown shattered the myth that only the naive fall victim to manipulation. Many followers were educated, socially conscious, and motivated by ideals of justice and equality. What bound them was not ignorance, but trust. Once trust was weaponized, logic lost its influence. Sleep deprivation, constant labor, and emotional pressure weakened resistance. Public loyalty rituals discouraged dissent. Private doubts became dangerous thoughts best kept hidden. Over time, survival within the group required emotional conformity. Leaving meant facing not only physical danger, but psychological collapse. This understanding shifted public conversations around cults and extremist groups. The focus moved away from ridicule and blame, toward recognizing the mechanics of influence and control. Jonestown became a case study in how environments, not individual weakness, often determine behavior. Government institutions were also forced to examine their own failures. Warnings about the People's Temple had circulated for years before the final tragedy. Complaints from families, defectors, and journalists raised red flags that were acknowledged but not aggressively pursued. Jurisdictional confusion, limited resources, and political hesitation all contributed to delayed intervention. Jonestown exposed how bureaucratic caution can become lethal when confronting non-traditional threats. Congressman Leo Ryan's visit represented a rare attempt at direct accountability, yet it arrived too late and without sufficient protection. His death underscored the risks faced by those who challenge opaque systems operating beyond conventional oversight. In the wake of the tragedy, policies surrounding overseas investigations, citizen protection, and cult monitoring were reviewed. However, no reform could reverse what had already occurred. Jonestown remained a stark reminder that delayed action carries irreversible consequences. For survivors and families of victims, the aftermath was defined by grief complicated by public misunderstanding. Many were forced to defend the dignity of their loved ones against narratives that portrayed them as foolish or irrational. This stigma deepened the pain, suggesting blame where none belonged. Survivors described struggling not only with loss, but with guilt for having lived. Counseling and support systems were limited, as society had little precedent for addressing trauma on such a scale. Healing required reframing the narrative, from one of mockery or disbelief to one of compassion and understanding. Over time, families worked to ensure that victims were remembered as individuals with dreams, relationships, and agency, rather than as anonymous figures in a tragic statistic. Their efforts helped shift public perception, emphasizing that manipulation can overpower even the strongest sense of self. Media coverage of Jonestown also underwent critical reassessment. Early reporting often focused on shock value, emphasizing sensational imagery over context. While photographs and headlines captured attention, they sometimes obscured the deeper mechanisms that led to the tragedy. Journalists later acknowledged the importance of responsible storytelling, one that prioritizes explanation over spectacle. Jonestown demonstrated that how stories are told can influence whether lessons are learned or lost. Over time, documentaries, books, and academic studies attempted to correct early oversimplifications. The goal shifted toward educating audiences about warning signs, patterns of control, and the importance of intervention. Jonestown became not only a historical event, but a teaching tool, used to illustrate how language, authority, and fear can shape reality. Responsible storytelling emerged as an essential safeguard against repetition. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered popular language after Jonestown, often used casually to describe blind loyalty. For families and survivors, this trivialization was deeply painful. It reduced complex suffering to a joke, stripping the tragedy of its human weight. Critics argued that such language obscured the truth, that most victims were coerced, not willing participants. Over time, advocacy groups worked to challenge these expressions, urging greater sensitivity in how Jonestown is referenced. Language matters because it shapes memory. When tragedies are reduced to clichés, the warnings they carry lose power. Jonestown's legacy depends not only on remembering what happened, but on how it is discussed. Precision, empathy, and restraint are essential to honoring those who died and protecting those who may face similar manipulation in the future. Jonestown also influenced how communities recognize early warning signs of dangerous leadership. Experts identified recurring patterns. Leaders who demand absolute loyalty, discourage outside relationships, frame criticism as persecution, and present themselves as the sole source of truth. These behaviors are now widely taught as red flags across educational and professional settings. While no system can eliminate risk entirely, awareness increases the chance of intervention before control becomes total. Jonestown demonstrated that prevention begins with questioning authority, not demonizing belief. Faith, ideology, and community are not inherently dangerous. They become so when power is centralized and accountability disappears. This distinction remains one of the most important lessons drawn from the tragedy. Decades later, Jonestown continues to resonate because its structure has not vanished. Similar dynamics appear in extremist movements, abusive organizations, and authoritarian groups worldwide. Technology has changed the methods, but not the mechanics. Isolation can now be emotional or digital rather than geographic. Propaganda spreads faster. Control adapts. Jonestown serves as a reference point, reminding observers that the conditions for abuse do not belong solely to the past. Vigilance requires constant reassessment of how power operates in evolving forms. The tragedy warns against complacency, urging societies to remain attentive to emerging patterns of coercion. Remembering Jonestown responsibly requires resisting both sensationalism and simplification. It demands attention to nuance, context, and human vulnerability. Each life lost represented a story interrupted, relationships severed, futures erased. Memorial efforts have sought to restore individuality to victims, listing names rather than numbers. This act of remembrance counters the anonymity imposed by mass tragedy. It reinforces the principle that no one should be reduced to a cautionary symbol alone. Jonestown is remembered not to inspire fear, but to cultivate understanding. Only through understanding can prevention become possible. The assassination of Leo Ryan remains inseparable from the Jonestown narrative. His death represents the collision between democratic accountability and authoritarian secrecy. Ryan's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths reflects the importance of oversight in protecting vulnerable populations. His loss serves as a reminder that transparency often carries risk, yet remains essential. Without individuals willing to question power, abuse flourishes unseen. Ryan's legacy underscores the responsibility of institutions to support those who challenge hidden systems, rather than leaving them exposed. Together, the murder at the airstrip and the deaths at Jonestown form a single continuum of cause and effect. One act of violence triggered another, each rooted in fear of exposure. The tragedy demonstrates how secrecy accelerates destruction once control begins to fracture. When authority depends on silence, truth becomes a threat. Jonestown collapsed not because it was exposed, but because it could not survive exposure. This distinction is crucial. Transparency does not create tragedy, it reveals it. Jonestown was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions, delays, and deference to authority. Each missed opportunity for intervention compounded the risk. Each ignored warning allowed manipulation to deepen. Recognizing this does not assign blame to victims, but responsibility to systems. The lesson is not that belief is dangerous, but that unchecked power is. Accountability, oversight, and open communication remain the strongest defenses against similar outcomes. Together, the murder at the airstrip and the deaths at Jonestown form a single continuum of cause and effect. One act of violence triggered another, each rooted in fear of exposure. The tragedy demonstrates how secrecy accelerates destruction once control begins to fracture. When authority depends on silence, truth becomes a threat. Jonestown collapsed not because it was exposed, but because it could not survive exposure. This distinction is crucial. Transparency does not create tragedy, it reveals it. To remember Jonestown is to honor lives lost by refusing to ignore the conditions that destroyed them. Memory becomes responsibility. Awareness becomes prevention. Silence becomes unacceptable. In preserving this history, the goal is not fear, but foresight. Jonestown stands as a permanent warning, one written not in ideology, but in human lives, and it asks future generations to listen before it is too late.